Why 1950s farmers started watering after sunset and doubled their crops. The year is 1952. In the heartland of America, something remarkable is happening on farms across the Midwest. Farmers who had struggled for generations to coax decent yields from their land were suddenly reporting harvests that seemed almost impossible. Corn stalks standing taller than ever before. Wheat fields so thick you could barely see the soil between the rows. And the secret? They'd simply changed when they watered their crops. Now, before you think this is just another farming tale, let me tell you, this story is rooted in real science, documented history, and a revolution that transformed American agriculture forever. What happened in those post-war years wasn't magic. It was the convergence of new technology, wartime innovations finally reaching civilian hands, and farmers who were desperate enough to try anything after the brutal lessons of the Dust Bowl still fresh in their memories. Let's go back to understand why this matters. American farming in the early 1950s was at a crossroads. The country had just come through World War II, and agriculture had been pushed to its limits to feed both the nation and allied forces overseas. Farmers had been urged to produce more, plant more, expand more. But there was a problem. The traditional methods of farming, methods passed down through generations, were hitting their ceiling. Most farmers still relied on rainfall and occasional irrigation during the hottest parts of the day. It made sense, right? The sun was beating down, the plants looked thirsty, so you watered them. This had been the practice since ancient times. If you look at agricultural texts from the 1920s and 1930s, they routinely recommended midday watering for most crops. The thinking was simple. Plants need water when it's hot, so give it to them when it's hot. But here's where science started catching up with tradition. During World War II, university research stations had been conducting studies on plant physiology, trying to maximize food production for the war effort. Agricultural scientists at institutions like Iowa State University, Purdue University, and the University of California were making discoveries about how plants actually use water, and what they found challenged everything farmers thought they knew. Plants, it turns out, lose a tremendous amount of water through a process called transpiration. It's similar to how humans sweat. Tiny pores on the leaves, called stomata, open up to take in carbon dioxide for photosynthesis, but when they do, water vapor escapes. During the intense heat of midday, with the sun beating down, these stomata actually start to close to prevent the plant from losing too much water. It's a survival mechanism. The plant essentially shuts down its water loss to avoid desiccation. So here's the kicker. When farmers watered at noon, when the sun was at its peak, much of that water was evaporating before it ever reached the roots. The water that did reach the soil surface often evaporated quickly from the heat, and because the plant's stomata were partially closed to conserve water, they couldn't even take full advantage of the moisture that was available. It was terribly inefficient. The research coming out of these agricultural stations in the late 1940s showed something fascinating. Plants do most of their growing at night. During the day, they're focused on photosynthesis, converting sunlight into energy. But at night, that's when the real growth happens. That's when cells divide and expand. That's when roots push deeper into the soil. That's when stems elongate. And all of that requires water. Scientists began recommending evening and early morning watering. Water the crops after sunset, they said, and you'll see the difference. The temperatures are cooler, so less evaporation. The plant's stomata are fully open in the early evening, ready to take in moisture. The water has all night to soak deep into the soil, reaching the root zone where it's actually needed. And the plants can use that moisture during their peak growing hours, the nighttime hours that most farmers had never even thought about. But here's the thing about farmers. They're skeptical, and they have every right to be. Farming is a risky business. One bad decision can mean a year without income. So when university extension agents started showing up at granges and farm bureaus in the early 1950s, talking about watering after sunset, a lot of farmers just shook their heads. It went against everything their fathers and grandfathers had taught them. However, there were always a few willing to experiment. In Iowa, a farmer named Harold Mitchell decided to try it on a test plot of corn in 1951. Harold was a veteran who'd come back from the war with a belief in science and new methods. He divided his cornfield in half. One half he watered at noon, like he always had. The other half he watered after sunset, starting around 7 in the evening. The results that fall were undeniable. The evening watered section yielded nearly 43 bushels per acre, more than the noon watered section. Word spread quickly. By the next spring, neighbors were asking Harold questions. The local farm bureau invited him to speak. And that summer of 1952, dozens of farms across Iowa were trying evening irrigation. Now this is where technology comes into the picture. Because there's a practical problem with evening watering. You need the right equipment. During the day, a farmer could watch his irrigation lines, move his equipment, fix any problems. Doing this after sunset meant working in the dark. And in the early 1950s, most farms didn't have the electrical infrastructure or the portable lighting that would make nighttime work easy. This is where wartime surplus came to the rescue. After World War II, there was an enormous surplus of military equipment. Portable generators, floodlights, water pumps, all of this equipment had been mass-produced for the war effort and was now being sold off cheap. Farmers who had never been able to afford mechanization suddenly found they could buy military surplus pumps for a fraction of what civilian models cost. Portable generators that had powered field hospitals and command posts were now lighting up cornfields in Kansas and wheat fields in Nebraska. The timing was perfect. The technology met the knowledge at exactly the right moment. By 1953, agricultural extension services across the country were actively promoting evening irrigation. The Soil Conservation Service, established after the Dust Bowl, published bulletins with detailed recommendations. State agricultural departments held demonstrations. And farmers, seeing their neighbors' success, began converting their watering schedules en masse. The impact was remarkable. In regions where irrigation was common, places like California's Central Valley, the High Plains, and parts of the Pacific Northwest, crop yields began climbing steadily. A study conducted by the University of Nebraska in 1954 tracked corn yields across the state and found that farms using evening irrigation averaged yields that were 60% higher than those still using midday watering. 60%. That wasn't just a marginal improvement, that was transformational. But let's talk about what this meant for actual farm families. Because this wasn't just about statistics and yield numbers, this was about survival and prosperity during a time when American agriculture was consolidating. Small farms were disappearing as larger operations bought them out. Any advantage could mean the difference between keeping your land or selling it off. Take the Murphy family in central Illinois. They'd been farming the same quarter section, 160 acres, since the 1880s. By the early 1950s, John Murphy and his wife Helen were barely breaking even. The farm was small by modern standards, and they couldn't compete with bigger operations on efficiency. But when their county extension agent demonstrated evening watering in 1953, John decided to try it. The Murphys didn't have much money for equipment, but John bought a used military surplus pump and some aluminum irrigation pipe at auction. He rigged up a system where he could water his cornfield in the evenings after supper. That first year, their corn yield jumped from 58 bushels per acre to 94 bushels per acre. Suddenly, they weren't just breaking even, they were profitable. They kept their farm for another generation. Stories like the Murphys were repeated thousands of times across rural America. Evening irrigation became one of several innovations that helped mid-sized family farms survive the transition to modern agriculture. It wasn't the only factor. Fertilizers, hybrid seeds, and mechanization all played roles, but it was significant. Now, the science behind why evening watering works is even more interesting than you might think. Modern research has expanded on what those 1950s agricultural scientists discovered. We now know that plants have something called circadian rhythms, just like humans do. They have internal biological clocks that regulate when different processes happen. During daylight hours, plants prioritize photosynthesis. The stomata open wide to take in carbon dioxide, accepting the water loss that comes with it. The plant is in production mode, and if you will, but as the sun sets and darkness approaches, the plant shifts into growth mode. The stomata don't close completely. They actually remain partially open in many species, allowing for both gas exchange and water uptake. without the massive evaporative losses that happen in sunlight. Soil moisture also behaves differently at night. During the day, water in the soil is constantly moving upward through capillary action, being pulled toward the surface where it evaporates. This means that water you apply at midday is fighting against this upward movement. But at night, when the soil surface is cooler than the deeper layers, water movement is more stable. Water applied in the evening has a chance to penetrate deeply and distribute evenly through the soil profile. Root activity follows a similar pattern. Roots grow primarily at night, particularly the fine root hairs that are responsible for most water and nutrient uptake. When you water in the evening, you're ensuring that moisture is available exactly when the roots are most actively growing and most capable of absorbing it. There's also the matter of fungal diseases. Now, you might think that watering in the evening would create problems with mold and mildew, since the foliage stays wet overnight. And for some crops in some climates this can be an issue, but the research from the 1950s, confirmed by later studies, showed that in most field crops, corn, wheat, soybeans, cotton, the benefits far outweighed any disease risks. The key was proper spacing and air circulation, which most American farms already practiced. In fact, midday watering could create its own disease problems. When water hits hot leaves, it can cause thermal shock. The sudden temperature change can damage leaf tissue, creating entry points for pathogens. Also, water droplets on leaves in bright sunlight can act like tiny magnifying glasses, focusing light and causing burn spots. Evening watering avoided both issues. By the mid-1950s, the agricultural press was full of articles about the evening irrigation revolution. Farm Journal, Wallace's Farmer, and Successful Farming all ran features on farmers who had doubled their yields. Equipment manufacturers began marketing irrigation systems specifically designed for evening and nighttime use, with built-in timers and automated controls. The impact extended beyond just crop yields. Water conservation became a major benefit. In an era when the Ogallala aquifer was beginning to show signs of depletion from overpumping, using water more efficiently wasn't just smart farming. It was necessary for long-term sustainability. Farmers who switched to evening irrigation found they could reduce their overall water use by 20 to 30%, while still improving yields. That meant lower pumping costs, less wear on equipment, and more sustainable use of groundwater resources. Regional variations emerged based on climate and crop type. In the humid southeast, where afternoon thunderstorms were common, farmers often split the difference, watering in the early morning before sunrise. In the arid southwest, evening watering became almost universal for irrigated crops. The high plains, where wind was a constant factor, found that evening watering reduced wind erosion because the soil surface stayed moist and cohesive overnight. California's Central Valley became a particular success story. Fruit and nut orchards had traditionally been watered during the heat of the day, but growers who switched to evening irrigation saw remarkable improvements in fruit size and quality. Almond growers reported larger nuts with better kernel fill. Peach orchards produced fruit with better color and sugar content. The California Agricultural Experiment Station documented these results in a series of bulletins that are still referenced today. But not every farmer made the switch, and that's important to understand. Agriculture is conservative by necessity, and some farmers simply couldn't justify the equipment investment or didn't have access to the electrical power needed for nighttime operations. In regions dependent entirely on rainfall, the whole discussion was academic, and some crops, particularly certain vegetables, didn't show the same dramatic response to evening watering that field crops did. There were also generational differences. Younger farmers, particularly veterans who'd returned from World War II with exposure to new technologies and methods, were more willing to experiment. Older farmers often stuck with what they knew. This created an interesting dynamic in rural communities, sometimes causing tension, but more often leading to mentorship relationships where younger and older farmers learned from each other. The economic impact of the evening irrigation revolution rippled outward. Grain elevators saw increased volumes. Equipment dealers sold more pumps and irrigation supplies. Small-town banks found their farm loans more secure as yields increased. Rural electrification cooperatives saw increased demand for power in the evening hours. which actually helped stabilize their load patterns and improve their financial viability. There were unexpected social effects too. Because watering happened in the evening, it became a family activity. Children would help move irrigation pipes after coming home from school. Families would work together in the cooler evening hours rather than during the brutal heat of midday. Some farmers reported that this shift actually improved their quality of life. Working in the evening meant they could rest during the hottest part of the day. The scientific understanding continued to evolve through the 1950s and beyond. Researchers discovered that different crops had different optimal watering times. Corn and wheat responded best to evening watering. Cotton showed good results with early morning irrigation. Rice, grown in flooded fields, was obviously on a different schedule altogether. The simple message of water after sunset became more nuanced as farmers learned to match irrigation timing to crop biology. By the end of the 1950s, evening irrigation had become standard practice on most irrigated farms in America. The revolution had been fully integrated into normal farming operations. Universities updated their textbooks. Agricultural extension services made it part of their standard recommendations. A new generation of farmers grew up never knowing any other way. The legacy of this shift is still with us today. Modern center-pivot irrigation systems, those giant sprinklers you see rolling across fields in a circular pattern, are typically programmed to run at night. Drip irrigation systems, which deliver water directly to plant roots, often operate on nighttime schedules. Even home gardeners are now commonly advised to water in the evening or early morning rather than midday. The productivity gains that American agriculture achieved in the post-war decades, the period when yields skyrocketed and the United States became the world's breadbasket, had many causes. Hybrid seeds, synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, mechanization, and better soil management all played roles. But the simple shift to evening watering was a significant piece of that puzzle, one that's often overlooked in agricultural histories. What makes this story particularly American is how it combines scientific innovation with practical farming wisdom, how it leveraged wartime technology for peaceful purposes, and how it spread through the decentralized network of farmers helping farmers that has always characterized rural America. There was no top-down mandate. No government program forced farmers to change. It spread because it worked, because neighbors talked to neighbors, because farmers are ultimately pragmatic people who will adopt any practice that helps them succeed. The 1950s evening irrigation revolution also represents a broader principle in agriculture. Timing matters just as much as technology. You can have the best equipment, the best seeds, the best soil, but if you're applying inputs at the wrong time, you won't get optimal results. This principle extends to fertilization, pest control, planting dates, and harvest timing. The farmers who learned this lesson with irrigation carried it forward into other aspects of their operations. Today, with precision agriculture and computer-controlled systems, we've taken the lessons of the 1950s and multiplied them. Farmers can now monitor soil moisture in real time, adjust irrigation schedules automatically based on weather forecasts, and deliver exactly the right amount of water at exactly the right time. But the fundamental insight that plants use water more efficiently at night remains unchanged. The story of evening irrigation is also a reminder of how quickly agricultural knowledge can spread when conditions are right. Within just a few years, a practice that had been virtually unknown became standard across millions of acres. This rapid adoption happened because farmers saw results, because the technology was available and affordable, and because institutions like land-grant universities and extension services were there to support and document the change. It's worth noting that other countries were discovering similar principles around the same time. Israeli farmers, working in an even more water-scarce environment, were developing drip irrigation and nighttime watering techniques. Australian farmers dealing with drought conditions were experimenting with irrigation timing. The science of plant-water relations was advancing globally, but the rapid, widespread adoption in the United States was unique in scale. The environmental implications of more efficient water use can't be overstated. The Ogallala Aquifer, which underlies the Great Plains from South Dakota to Texas, has been called the most important aquifer in the world. It supplies water to about 30% of the groundwater used for irrigation in the United States. If farming practices in the 1950s hadn't become more efficient, if evening irrigation and other water-saving techniques hadn't been adopted, the depletion of this vital resource would have been even more severe than it has been. Looking at old photographs from the 1950s, you can sometimes spot the evidence of this revolution. Pictures of farms taken in the evening often show irrigation systems in operation, water arcing through the air as the sun sets. Those images, preserved in county historical societies and family photo albums across rural America, document a quiet transformation that changed the American landscape. The human element of this story deserves emphasis. These weren't corporate farms or agricultural conglomerates making these changes. These were family farmers, people working land that had been in their families for generations, making careful decisions about investments and practices. Every change carried risk. The farmers who first tried evening irrigation were taking a chance, trusting in science that contradicted their own experience and the wisdom of their parents. Consider what it took for a farmer in 1952 to make this change. First, the investment in equipment, pumps, pipes, generators, lights. That might represent several $1,000s, a huge sum at the time. Then the labor of installing everything, learning to operate it, maintaining it. Then the anxiety of waiting through the growing season to see if the new method actually worked. And all of this while still doing all the other work required to run a farm. But they did it. Across the country, thousands of farmers made that leap, and their willingness to try something new, to trust in science and observation over tradition, helped transform American agriculture. It's a pattern that's repeated throughout agricultural history. Innovation comes from the combination of research and practice, of scientists and farmers working together, even if they don't always realize they're collaborating. The story also illustrates the importance of agricultural institutions that many Americans don't think about. Land-grant universities, established by the Morrill Acts of 1862 and 1890, were specifically created to make scientific education accessible to ordinary people and to conduct research relevant to agriculture. The extension services, created by the Smith-Lever Act of 1914, were designed to bring university research directly to farmers. This infrastructure, publicly funded, practically focused, regionally tailored, was essential to spreading innovations like evening irrigation. Without these institutions, the scientific discoveries about plant water use might have remained in academic journals, never reaching the farmers who could actually use them. And without farmers willing to experiment and share their results, the science might have remained theoretical. It was the combination that created change. As we look back now, more than 70 years later, the evening irrigation revolution of the 1950s seems almost quaint. We have so many more sophisticated tools and techniques, but the fundamental lesson remains relevant. Paying attention to plant biology, matching practices to natural processes, and being willing to question traditional methods can lead to dramatic improvements. For modern farmers facing climate change, water scarcity, and the need to produce more food with fewer resources, the story of 1950s irrigation offers both inspiration and instruction. It shows that significant progress is possible, that science and practice can work together, and that changing long-held habits can pay dividends that last for generations. The farmers who made this shift in the 1950s are mostly gone now, but their legacy lives on in every irrigated field, in every computer-controlled irrigation system, in every agricultural textbook that recommends evening watering. They were part of a revolution that was quiet, practical, and profoundly effective. And perhaps that's the most American part of this story, that real change often comes not from dramatic declarations or sweeping reforms, but from practical people making informed decisions, trying new things, and sharing what works with their neighbors. The farmers who started watering after sunset weren't trying to revolutionize agriculture. They were just trying to grow better crops and provide for their families. But in doing so, they helped feed a nation and set practices that continue to this day. The doubling of crop yields wasn't instantaneous for everyone, and it wasn't just about watering time. But for many farmers, switching to evening irrigation was the key that unlocked better results from all their other efforts. The hybrid seeds worked better with adequate moisture at night. The fertilizers were more effective, when water was available to carry nutrients to roots. The improved cultivation practices paid off when plants had the water they needed during their peak growing hours. In the end, the story of why 1950s farmers started watering after sunset is really a story about the power of observation, the value of scientific research, and the courage to change. It's about a generation of farmers who lived through the Depression and the Dust Bowl, who served in World War II or kept farms running while others fought, and who came back determined to build something better. They were willing to try new methods, invest in new equipment, and trust that reason and evidence could guide them to prosperity. Their success reminds us that progress in agriculture and in any field often comes from paying attention to how nature actually works rather than how we assume it works. The plants had always grown more at night. They had always used water more efficiently in cooler temperatures. But it took careful observation and systematic research to turn that natural fact into practical advantage. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you found this story about agricultural history interesting and learned something new about how a simple change in timing revolutionized American farming, please consider subscribing to our channel for more content about the fascinating history of agriculture and rural life. Hit that like button if you enjoyed the video and share it with anyone who might appreciate learning about how American farmers helped feed the world. This video is inspired by real historical events and documented agricultural research. It is not intended to represent or offend any specific individuals or organizations. The farming practices described were real innovations that changed American agriculture, though individual stories have been used as representative examples of larger historical trends.